Right, so I am joined today on the podcast by Liam McNally. Welcome.
Thank you.
Liam is diversity, inclusion and belonging partner with Gitlab. So I feel like we're going to have quite a bit of ground to cover in this conversation on some pretty meaty topics there. But if you would just like to give us a brief intro, Liam, into you and your career so far, that'd be great.
Yeah, so my career's been pretty varied, especially over the last sort of 7 years or so. But initially started out, you can probably tell from the accent, in the UK. I started out in agency recruitment, working for...
The English person in recruitment, imagine that.
Groundbreaking. So yeah, I started out in the UK doing like finance and payroll recruitment, and then moved to Australia in 2014, where I met Emma for the first time.
Gosh, is it that long ago?
Yeah,
wow.
It was 2014 I moved, which is insane. Yeah, so 7 years ago, I'm working for a recruitment company called Aquent, working inside kind of that tech, marketing, design space, and wanted a massive change from working in that HR kind of payroll finance space. Just because it's not the most groundbreaking stuff, and I wanted something that was just a little bit more interesting. And so after working 2 years recruitment in on that side of things, I then moved into a kind of a tech startup, but was a furniture company. So it was kind of a weird kind of mix between tech and e-commerce. And I was running talent recruitment and kind of culture within inside that organization. So that was probably a very varied role. Built out the whole culture manifesto there, but also grew the team from, I think it was about 45 when I started to about 70 when I left. So like a lot of growth within that kind of year that I was there. But all in the meantime, whilst I was working there, I'd been involved in kind of the crypto space and the blockchain space, kind of from an investor perspective, and was looking to kind of venture into that world. So I got a role at Consensus as their talent recruitment and people lead for the APAC region. And when I started there, and that was an all remote company. That was the first time I worked all remote, and that was 4 years ago. So yeah, I've been doing the remote thing for probably about 4 years now. And I was there building out the whole processes for a HR function within APAC, whilst also building a team globally alongside a number of different talent leads and people leads. And we grew from 110 when I first started. And after that first year, I was there, we was at 1,100. So that was like insane hyper growth. The most insane experience I've ever had inside a company, I have to say. It was like really seeing how culture can shift when you get into hyper growth. And just like how politics can change within inside an organization, but then also how all remote can be done really well, but also how it can be done kind of not so well when you're working in lots of different cross-functional time zones and teams. And so after I finished up there, I moved over to Gitlab, and I joined there running as a recruitment manager for the engineering team. So moved more into a purely kind of recruitment role again. Gitlab's an all remote organization, has been all remote for 10 years. So literally since inception. It kind of happened kind of very organically. So it started out in San Francisco, as a lot of kind of tech businesses do, went through Y Combinator, as a lot of kind of really successful tech businesses do as well. And they had an office, and then people just weren't turning up, turning up to the office. And then they made a couple of hires in Ukraine. And then it was like, well, we've already got these hires that are working remote here. No one wants to really come into an office. Why don't we just be all remote and just hire people where we want to hire them? And it kind of just started from there, and it just proliferated from there. And now I moved from a recruitment role into a diversity, inclusion and belonging role. It's kind of like a HR business partner, but it's very specialized in diversity and inclusion and belonging. And so moving into that role, we've now got we've got people in 68 different countries. We're around 1,500 people. When I joined, I think we were around 300 people. So I've been here for 3 years now. So we've had a lot of hyper growth in those 3 years as well. Yeah, career's been it's been a whirlwind. It's been varied. It's been remote. It's been in office. It's been in hybrid. It's been a bit of everything. So
you've packed a lot into those. What was it? 7 years.
These last 7 years has been it's been a wild ride. 3 years at 3 years at Gitlab and 2 years at Aquent, and then a couple of startups in between.
Very cool. There's sort of two separate strands to this conversation, I think, both of which super interesting. One is the all remote and kind of how that works, and both from the cultural perspective, but also just the mechanics of, you know, how do you hire people in that space. So I'm interested to talk about that. Also really interested to talk about diversity, inclusion and belonging, and what that means in terms of what your role actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. Which one would you prefer to start with?
Let's start with all remote. Let's start with that, since I've already talked about it, so why not?
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by how this works, as I say, both from a recruitment perspective, but then also kind of how culture is maintained.
Mm-hmm.
When you're just thinking on the recruitment side of things, say for example, you know, we're going to hire a dev. Is it literally a case of we can hire that person anywhere in the world, or?
Yeah, so I would say 9 times out of 10, you can hire that person anywhere in the world. We have some roles where they have to work with, say, federal government in the US, where they have to have certain clearances, you have to be a US citizen and things like that. But those are pretty few and far between. So I would say 9 times out of 10, if we can go and hire that person anywhere in the world, and we're quite intentional about it as well.
Okay.
So if we see a team is becoming very homogenous and becoming either very focused in the EU or focused in the US or APAC, that doesn't happen as often, but if it's very focused in those areas, we'll actually make a concerted effort to say, right, we need to start diversifying our team to ensure that we maintain our values and our culture. Because part of our values and our culture is working asynchronously. So it's not about making sure that we can all work together at the same time and move through work. We want to make sure that we're still maintaining things like asynchronous communication, and transparency, and just like how the kind of GitLab mindset works. So we are quite intentional about that, about making sure that we go and hire those people all around the world. Kind of a little bit different when you think about, I say, like sales roles, for example, where you kind of have to be in location.
Sure.
If you're selling to an Australian market, you need to have market knowledge, but you also need to be able to get on the phone to those people or meet them in person. So sometimes those roles can be a little bit more specific, but then, like, even then we call it A and Z. And so most of the people that are working, they work cross-functionally with New Zealand clients or Australian clients, and they're based all around Australia as well. So it's not like they're just purely focused in Sydney or Melbourne, like metropolitan areas. Like they are still fairly distributed.
When it's as broad as that, where do you even start?
Yeah,
you know, I think about my own sort of recruitment process, and it's pretty, you know, location centered. So I at least kind of have a starting point. Where do you even start when it can be anywhere?
That's a really good question. And I think the way we do it is that we will be constantly searching and finding that talent, regardless of whether we have open roles, so that we already have those pools already there, and we can say, okay, look, we've got these awesome people in Romania, we've got these awesome people in London, we've got these awesome people in Singapore. And so we will then start bringing them through the process like that. So we're constantly just looking and trying to find amazing devs, amazing solution architects, amazing marketing UX folks. So we'll be constantly doing that, and it would be a very much more of a proactive rather than a reactive kind of process, and that lends itself to remote. But also we have a really big sourcing function. So so they're really focusing on those really hard to fill roles, and because our bar is quite high in terms of our technical entry, but any role really it is quite high. We have to be constantly doing that anyway, and then we have to think a bit about compliance and process, and especially now that we're a public company, we have to be a lot more mindful of things like that. So we definitely push, we'd be definitely pushing to have PEOs, or like payroll providers in certain regions, or entities within certain regions as well. So we have a list of countries that we can kind of recruit into, and the like. The list is long.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, the list is long, but it's not every country in the world, because
Sure.
there are some countries where they have bigger tax implications, or setting up an entity in that country is very, very difficult, and the like. So there's lots of things that we have to take into consideration when we're thinking about that. But then we also, we know where we've done a lot of research, a lot of talent mapping, and we know where strong Ruby on Rails developers are. So we will make sure that we kind of focus in on those areas. And then the other part, we haven't moved on to the diversity, inclusion, belonging part, but we look at those teams, we look at the engineering team. Okay, we need to try, how do we make that team diverse? We know that it's very homogenous at the moment. And we probably need to have more women within that engineering team. How can we do that from the top of the funnel, but also ensure that at the end of the process, the person that is most qualified for the role gets the job. So we have to we are really mindful about what our top of funnel really looks like.
How does it work from a financial perspective? Like, in what currency are people paid, and how does that change across countries? How do you go about kind of setting that bar or that level, as it were?
Yeah, so in general, everybody's paid in their local currency. That's not always the case. Some places are paid in USD, especially in Latin America, they'll get paid in USD. But we have a pretty complex compensation philosophy. It's not complex, but it's complex enough where I would suggest jumping into our handbook and having a look at our compensation philosophy. But we have a compensation calculator, essentially, that sits across the whole business, and it sits across all of the different countries, and it's evolved over time. But what we use like a standard San Francisco salary, and it's usually within the kind of 70-80 percentile of what a San Francisco kind of engineer would be paid. And then we base that on local currencies, local markets elsewhere. So we'll look at things like price of property and rent in those markets, what the economy's like, and just generally look at what that looks like. And then we'll work with maybe a consulting partner to build that out into what a score might look like for that region. So for example, Sydney is 0.7 of what an engineer or a diversity, inclusion, belonging partner would get in San Francisco. So say an engineer, I think, is at 160,000 in San Francisco, so it'll be 0.7 of that, so 70% of that in USD. And that usually translates to a pretty good salary inside Australia and elsewhere around the world. So we try to still keep it up into that kind of top percentile. And if we start seeing people declining roles for salaries within those regions, then we go and relook at it and figure out what we're doing wrong and bring that up. So it can get complex. And we have a whole total rewards team that deals with that on a kind of monthly basis in terms of going through that data and making sure that we're still up to trend on that. But it gets difficult.
Sure. From a personal perspective, how have you found working for an all remote company? Was it a bit of a challenge to get used to it, or?
Yeah, I think for me with Gitlab, it was a very different experience than my previous role, simply because Gitlab has literally no offices anywhere in the world, whereas Consensus had hubs all around the world. So they had like London office, they had a New York office, San Francisco, they had a couple of other offices as well. So there was still kind of that remote versus in office kind of vibe. There was people that were getting more FaceTime with certain people and had different reputations inside the organization and the like. When I moved to Gitlab, it really kind of brought home how remote could be really, really done well. And Consensus did do it well. It just did it in a very hybrid approach, whereas this was very much more remote. It did take some getting used to, in that Emma, you know me, like we've worked in the office before. I do thrive off engaging with people around the office and having chats and things like that. So figuring out in my mind what that looks like in an all remote environment was definitely tough for the first like month or two. But once you figure out that You can either go and work in co-working spaces, you can go and find that in a cafe, or you have the opportunity to go out at, you don't have to work your traditional 9 to 5. So I can go to the gym at 10 o'clock and get my interaction there. So I do CrossFit and we have a good class, and I can do that at 10 o'clock rather than having to do it at 6 p.m. or early in the morning. So I can get all of these things done that provides me with all that different social interaction that during the day that I kind of would get from a work environment. But don't get me wrong, it's still, I don't think all remote is for everyone, but I think it's for a lot of people, and it's about how you and your expectations align with that and how your lifestyle aligns with that. But there's always going to be difficulties when, say, you want to get a decision made and you want to get it done in the next hour, but you know that the person that you're working with is
all in different time zones.
Time zones, they might be in bed, or it's at that moment in time, they've got to look after the kids and things like that, which with GitLab we completely respect, and we don't expect people to kind of do that. And so you have to kind of adapt your working style sometimes to other people's working styles. And so that's what there's a lot of healthy kind of toing and throwing there about how we always make it work.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Nad, about the out of hours thing, because I was just thinking that as you were talking, and particularly in Australia, we're kind of at the opposite end of time to certainly Europe or the US, where there's much more crossover in where they are in their time during the day. Do you find then that you're doing more quote unquote sort of out of hours work, or is it that you just structure your day differently to work at a different time?
Yeah, I think it all depends on what people regard as out of hours. So I structure my day so that I can do things in the afternoons, which most people in a 9 to 5 office can't. So, I'll always take a nap at some point. I'll
Very civilized.
go to the gym. I'll walk the dog for an hour. So there's like 3 hours during the day that I will tend to not do any work, or I'll just like maybe look at my phone on Slack and whatnot. And so that means I will get up probably 7 o'clock and just get a bit of crossover time with the US PST time zone and ET time zones, and some people in America. So I get a bit of crossover time there. And often if I need to do something in the evenings, so say if it's like a 6 p.m. call with Europe, I'm able to do that because I know I've had time off during the day. So I just structure my day differently, but that's not how everyone does it as well. I think that's unique to my work experience. I know that there's people in Australia and Europe and the like who they just do their 9 to 5, they block it off in the calendar, and they love to work asynchronously. So they will do everything via documents or via GitLab. We have this thing called GitLab issues or merge requests. So they'll just do it all by that, and very rarely have a synchronous meeting with someone. And that's completely fine for them to do as well. So we're able to accommodate for everybody's working styles. This way just works for me best.
It's really interesting. I'm just kind of thinking from my own perspective, like how I would structure that. And it's interesting what you said at the beginning, because that was probably my initial thought about it, of just you lose that sort of buzz of being around other people in the office. But I guess, as you said, it's about thinking of ways to bring that in other avenues. You haven't necessarily got your colleagues around you physically, but whether it's the gym or, I don't know, meeting a friend for lunch, or finding ways to have that interpersonal reaction still.
Yeah, and it really changes. Like pre-COVID, I worked in Hong Kong for 3 weeks, and I did that all in a co-working space. I went to the US and worked in the US in different co-working spaces and met people like that. I did Bali for 6 weeks. So you can do things
You're making me a bit jealous.
But you can do things that you can't traditionally do in other organizations. Because you can go and work wherever you want, as long as you keep your tax residency in the station. That's pretty much it.
Interesting. It's very cool. Let's move on to diversity, inclusion, and belonging, because I'm really interested to find out a bit more about specifically kind of what that means for you as an organisation and what that means in terms of your own role on a daily basis. Can you kind of talk me through it more broadly and then kind of more specifically in terms of, yeah, what that means for your day to day?
Yeah, sure. So the way we kind of view diversity, inclusion, and belonging at GitLab is diversity is what the company looks like. So if you go on a call, what does the diversity look like? And that can be from gender through to race and ethnicity. That can be sexual orientation, geographic locations, disability and the like. So it covers a broad spectrum of things, but what does that actually look like within inside the organization? And in inclusion, we think about it is, do those people have a seat at the table? So they're not just there to be a face, they are there to actually have a seat at the table, be a part of decision making, and be a part of our culture. And then the belonging piece is taking those two pieces and then go, does everybody that's working here actually feel like they belong and their voice is heard? So they've been included to have a voice, but is it actually heard? Is it actioned upon? And what does that then look like in terms of their engagement with inside the organization? And the belonging piece can often include the equity side of things as well. So you've probably heard of EI. So it can include that equity side of things, where we're like, are we actually elevating underrepresented groups within inside the organization as well? So when we're building out programs, we look at those three things as like, you know, when we're looking at diversity, we look at maybe things like recruitment programs and internship programs, and like how are we building those to ensure that they have a cross section of society. And then we're thinking about inclusion, like how are we educating our team members about allyship and about neurodiversity and psychological safety and things along those lines. And the belonging piece is then bringing all of that together into one cohesive program that will hopefully ensure that everybody feels like they belong. And then, go on, sorry.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, and then I guess from like a daily basis, what does that look like? And it's so varied because diversity, inclusion, and belonging, it sits across every aspect of an organization. It's not just a team and the team does diversity, inclusion, and belonging. When we think about total rewards, like we have to look at what equal pay looks like across all underrepresented groups and make sure that we're looking at that data really specifically and going, is there any underrepresented group that is being marginalized here? And what corrections do we need to make? And do we need to add more budget to ensure that that doesn't happen anymore? And do we need to train more? Do we need to train people more? It can be as, it can go to events. So if we recently had our GitLab Contribute event, what does that look like from a diversity, inclusion, and belonging perspective? Do the speakers represent diversity? Are the people that are speaking from ethical backgrounds and organizations and things like that? And it really can get super complex. So my day-to-day is not a day-to-day, if that makes sense. What I'm working on a day-to-day basis is different all the time. At the moment, I'm working heavily on a neurodiversity in the workplace course within inside the organization, but a part of the week might be working on a reverse AMA where someone from our leadership group is speaking with the underrepresented group to try and understand what GitLab can do better to make their experience better at GitLab. Then on the other side, it could be hosting an allyship learning group. So getting people that maybe aren't from traditional underrepresented groups, or they're from an underrepresented group but want to be an ally to, say, LGBTQI people. So really helping them understand what that could look like and what allyship looks like. It could be consulting with specific teams about their experience within the organization and helping train the manager to ensure that they become more inclusive. And it can go to really things that you wouldn't necessarily think are part of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but it can go to things like swag, where we say we send out swag to all of our team members, and for a cross section of people it doesn't fit, and it's because we didn't go out and actually investigate about whether this is going to fit every team member that we have. So just things like that, and ensuring that people feel like they belong and they're included regardless of who they are, where they are from, and the like. So it can be very varied, and it can very interesting. Obviously there's other sides to it where we look at employee relations and stuff like that as well. So yeah, it's a very varied but exciting role.
You mentioned neurodiversity as part of that. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so the way we haven't truly defined neurodiversity, but the way I look at it is you kind of have people that sit across various different spectrums of neurodiversity to neurotypical. And when we think about neurodiversity, we think about people with ADHD, people with autism, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, things along those lines. And then thinking about how we can make the workplace right for them, and ensuring that their learning styles, their working styles, and their communication styles are accounted for when we build any program, but also when they are interacting with leadership and their managers, or if they're a manager, when they're interacting with their team members and the like. So what we are truly trying to do is because I feel like it's still one of those things that is little known, or at least little serviced. It's not serviced as much as, say, women in tech, or Black people in tech, or ethnic minorities in tech. So what we're trying to do is get people to truly understand that everybody's different, and some people have, I don't like to call it a condition, but they have other typical brain functions.
Sure.
That means that they just need a different kind of accommodation within their working styles.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to build at the moment, a short course that allows all team members and managers to go, okay, right, this is what I need to do if somebody tells me that they are neurodiverse. But these are also the things that I can do to just make a workplace more inclusive. Because the way I think about neurodiversity and inclusivity is that if we build an organization that caters for people that are neurodiverse, we're going to make everybody else's life easier. Because if we start asking everyone, how do you like to be managed, and how do you like to what are your working styles, what are your communication styles, all of a sudden we start building out personalization for everyone. And the great offset of that is that people that are neurodiverse are going to then feel included right from the get-go. It's not an other kind of subject. It's going to kind of bring it to the fore straight away.
Yeah, just thinking as you were talking there around how sort of inclusivity and certainly diversity within an all remote business, that kind of almost seems like one side of it. But then if everyone's remote, how you then bring belonging. So it's almost by being all remote, one of those things is perhaps easier, wrong word, but is the other then more challenging? Because if everyone's remote, is it then harder to get that sense of belonging amongst those people?
That's a good question. And I actually would argue that it's kind of easier because everybody's in the same position, right? And I think this is where we're going to have a lot of talk about hybrid versus all remote, because I think I would say most organizations are going to kind of move into that hybrid world as we come out of this pandemic. And being all remote, it means that everybody already has something in common, and everybody is already facing a challenge with all remote. And most of the time you can ask somebody, how do you deal with this particular problem, and how do you deal with this particular problem? So arguably it makes it a lot easier to kind of build that belonging piece. I think sometimes that kind of culture piece can sometimes be a bit more difficult, in that you don't always know who you're talking to on the other end. It might be the first time you've met them, even though you've worked in the same organization for 3 years together. So trying to bring in those kind of water cooler conversations and those things into an all remote organization can be difficult. We do things called coffee chats. So you can go into like a channel and it will assign you a different coffee chat each week. Or we have our social chats where we can go and talk about different subjects within inside those social chats and the like. And then we use Slack really heavily. And Slack can be noisy at points, but there's a lot of places, for example, where you can go and have a have a chat about being gay, or or within our TMRGs, our team member resource groups, where you can talk about being Black at GitLab, or just Black in the world, especially in, you know, the current climate where these things are happening all the time. Being Latinx, or being or having a disability, or being a veteran, and how that all affects you. So there's lots of these conversations that happen. It just happens in a really different way. We're not having it in the office. We're not, you know, I remember when, you know, talking about Brexit in the office when that all happened, when I was still at Aquent, and you were having those conversations back and forth inside the room. It just happened different. It just happens differently. It happens via technology.
But it still happens.
But it still happens. So we have like, I'm gay, and we have internally at GitLab, we have Queer Lab, which is a private Slack channel just for people that identify as LGBTQI. And we'll have conversations there about family members saying transphobic things and supporting each other on that. Or we'll talk about holiday locations that we, you know, maybe we should avoid, and things like that. Just things that we, that you would have those conversations inside a, you know, a large office, but we just have it in just a really unique and different way.
Again, listening to you talk there, I would imagine, and you know, this is an assumption, please tell me if I'm wrong. My assumption is that for people that work at GitLab, this is a massive part of why they would want to work there. Does that come through from your employees?
100%. So we have an open source like handbook. So anybody, if you want to go off and read it, it's 10,000 pages long, so feel free to try and get through it all, but you can go and find
just a quiet Tuesday night.
You can find all of our stuff on our values and diversity, inclusion and belonging and all of that sort of stuff. So people go through and read that before they join GitLab, and they read that and they go, that's why I want to be here. You know? They want to be here because they can see that how we truly live our values. Like, I haven't worked at an organization before where you can actually see our values at play. And you could also see team members saying, hey, you're not adhering to our values. And that doesn't matter what level they're at. You'll see an intermediate engineer tell the CEO that probably isn't adhering to our values. Like, it's amazing. And so that's why people join. So they join because it's all remote and they want to experience that, and they want to work for a company that does it well. And they join because they see our values and they see that we are really pushing for diversity, inclusion and belonging, and they want to be a part of it. Part of our recruitment process as well is that if you're from an underrepresented group or not, you can go and chat to one of our team member resource groups. So you can go and chat to a member of our minorities in tech resource group, and you could ask them, what is your experience like as a minority at GitLab? So we give that opportunity to everybody that
that's great,
that gets to kind of an offer stage. We're changing that actually quite soon, so that anybody that gets the second interview can do that. So we take it seriously, and in turn, we have team members that join that truly understand what our values mean.
What if any differences do you see from Australia to other parts of the world that you work with from a diversity inclusion perspective? Do you think Australia gets it? Do you think there's still a way to go? Like, where do you sort of feel that it's at?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because my worldview is very skewed by my friends and the people that I associate with, right? And I think that's everybody's opinion. My view is probably slightly biased, because the people that I talk to about all of this stuff generally agree with me around those things, right? In general, that tends to be what the case is. But then you will definitely see and look on the news, and you'll have personal experiences where you think, maybe it's not quite as progressive as I might think, because I'm surrounding myself with people that are on the same wavelength as me. I think from a diversity, inclusion, belonging perspective, in terms of career paths within Australia, we're still behind. Like, I've been on a couple of panels and talks and stuff with inside Australia, and those panels aren't always the most diverse. So we still need the people that are diversity, inclusion, and belonging professionals aren't necessarily part of those groups sometimes. Don't get me wrong, I've been on panels where there's been plenty of women and the like, but it's still
they have to be, just to interrupt, do you think to be part of the conversation, or certainly leading that within an organization, you have to be?
I don't think you have to be, but I do think that if you're the leader of those conversations, you need to make sure those people are in the room. I'm very conscious about when I currently don't identify as neurodiverse, for example. There's a conversation about that my doctor thinks I have ADHD, but I'm not sure I do, and the like, right? So that's another conversation, but I don't currently self-identify as neurodiverse. But I'm building out a neurodiversity short course. I shouldn't be the person that's the voice of those people. Regardless of how many books I read, what seminars I do, I shouldn't be the voice of those people, but I can be the facilitator for that voice. That can 100% happen. So if you are somebody that's in that organization and you're talking about and you don't necessarily identify, sure, that's completely fine, but you need to make sure those people's voices are the ones that are going to
I suppose that's a key differentiator, isn't it? It's being the facilitator as opposed to being the perspective or the point of view.
Exactly. And that is a tough conversation, right? So like, I don't want to be on a panel talking about LGBTQI people with 4 other straight people and I'm an only gay person there. That doesn't sound like a fun experience for me, because I'm hearing about my experience from somebody's perspective. I haven't actually had that perspective before. So yeah, 100% they can be in leadership roles as long as they are facilitating those conversations and not being the voice of those conversations.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really key differentiation, isn't it? Thinking about companies who perhaps have some work to do in this space, and maybe they've got to that perspective where they know there's work to do, but they don't necessarily know where to start or how to go about it. Maybe they even feel uncomfortable about the conversation and don't, maybe they don't want to get it wrong or whatever it might be. What advice could you offer to those companies, those individuals, of how do you kind of start down this road?
Yeah, I think firstly, define what diversity inclusion looks like within the organization and do that through data. So survey the company, understand what the demographics are, obviously within the legal realms. To really understand what your demographics look like, but then also understand what is the perception within inside the organization. So how do people perceive their experience as a person from an underrepresented group? So we do it through Culture Amp, but we ask questions like, how engaged are you? How do you feel like your experience of career development is as somebody from your demographic and the like? So make sure you understand all of that first, really build out that survey and understand that data, and then think about what you're going to do with that data and build a program, a 6 to 12 month program out of that, and then constantly be iterating on that strategy. So that's my key takeaway, is always start from a place of data. Never just dive into it straight away. But I think if you're gonna, and I think that it needs to be very much from a top-down perspective. Executives need to be heavily involved with diversity, inclusion, belonging for everybody else to start caring about it. Don't get me wrong, it needs to be from the grassroots as well, when you need to have employee resource groups and things like that to make sure that people have an avenue to have a voice. But those employee resource groups should be sponsored by an executive or a senior leader within the company. They know that their voices are actually being heard right at the top.
One of my own, and it's going back a few years, but one of my own experiences, which wasn't particularly positive, but the intention was right, but the execution was wrong, was many years ago. Went to a meeting, you actually may have been with me. I can't remember if it was you or not, but went to a meeting at a large corporate, and the senior person from internal recruitment there said, we want more female developers. You're like, yeah, so does everyone. And their kind of take on it was, we will hire any female developer, just send us female developers, doesn't matter whether they're any good or not, we just want female developers.
Yeah.
Which in my opinion was kind of a problem in itself. But then the secondary problem was that they were actually, it was part of their bonus structure, was how many female developers they actually got into the organization. Yeah. How do you guard against that, where the intention is really honorable but the execution just goes wrong?
Yeah, I think the way we've looked at it internally is that we want to have a meritocracy. We don't want anybody to come in to Gitlab feeling like the only reason why they're here is because they're a woman, or it's because they're Black, or it's because they're Latinx, and the like. The reason why they're here is because they are good at what they do and they're good at their job. And if we wanted to hire more juniors and things like that, we'll develop internship programs, and again, we'll have a meritocracy based on that. But also ensure that we're making sure that people from underrepresented groups within inside the tech industry will apply and hopefully get down into that funnel. So I think you need to be very values driven when you're thinking about that. And then you also need to go, how am I going to make this person feel when they join? And am I setting this person up for success?
Yeah.
So, if you go and hire, say, for example, General Assembly is awesome, right? And they've got lots of engineers that are coming out of that. And there's lots of other ones in the US, like Full Stack Academy and things like that. But if you go and say, right, we're going to hire them straight into an intermediate engineer role, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to do that role. They'll be able to come in as a junior and work their way through. It's about what strategy are you actually putting in place to make sure that these people that are joining the organization are going to be successful. So, and take away quotas. It's not about quotas. It's about having a really strong recruitment process where you're attracting everybody to come and apply. If you're not getting female engineers applying, it's probably something wrong with your recruitment process. There's probably something wrong with your sourcing process as well, because you're not going and finding them. So
it's an interesting one. And it's one of those things, you mentioned quotas, that is often not often, but sometimes that's the terminology that comes up. And I have to say, personally, it's one of the things that makes me feel quite uncomfortable. I just don't like that approach. And I think exactly what you were just saying, how does that actually feel to the person on the receiving end of it when they're in a role that they're perhaps not really qualified for or ready for? And it then almost perpetuates the myth, because they can't deliver the role that they're in, and then, oh, look at that person, they can't do what they were meant to do, and so it goes on. It kind of feels, again, the intention was maybe good, but they were maybe trying to shortcut it instead of taking a longer term view of maybe it's about training and development, maybe it's about, I don't know, how we structure schooling, to get more women in tech was the example, but, to get more women into those types of subjects. So it's, the quota feels like a very from A to Z as opposed to going along the path.
And it's 100% okay to have targets. I think quote or idea of saying, right, we need to hire 100 female engineers by the end of the year. Or let's have a target for 5 years, and let's say we want to get the whole of our engineering organization to be 50-50, just for sake of argument. And that's what we want to do. Like, how do we do that over these next 5 years? Like, how do we do an internship program where we attract women into the role? How do we get juniors and train them into intermediates? How do we, and like, have a whole, strategy around a diversity, inclusion, and belonging strategy around how you're going to achieve that 50% target, rather than going, right, let's just make sure that it looks diverse. Like,
exactly. It's a bit of a feels a bit lazy, that approach, doesn't it? Of let's just get to the end and be done with it and move on to something else.
But then what happens next is that attrition happens, and then it's mainly women that are being made redundant or leaving or performance managed out because you haven't done the initial work.
Yeah,
Doesn't look great either.
No, it doesn't, and and doesn't feel great for the people involved in it either. A couple of final ones. What do you love about your job?
uh I think the main thing I love about my job is that I actually genuinely feel like I'm making a difference. And it might be only small incremental differences at the moment, but I know that I'm in a role where I can change the perception of what the tech industry could look like in the long term. And it might be only by a small percent at this point, but the ultimate aim for my job is to not have a job, right? And to make an organization so diverse and amazing that they don't need me anymore. So that is a really honorable kind of aim to have. And I don't think I've had that in my career before. So I think that is something that I really, really enjoy. But also just the varied nature of it. I get to work on so many different things. Every day is different. A little bit different from recruitment, where it can feel a bit like Groundhog Day sometimes.
Can do sometimes. What's your biggest challenge?
Biggest challenge is, I think it's about changing perceptions of talent, of industry, and often like of countries and things like that. So really trying to get people to understand that their perception versus reality is different. I think that's a huge one. And then also I think it's a tough one to kind of verbalize, I guess. It's like you need to get everybody involved in diversity inclusion. But people that aren't from underrepresented groups can be really quite uncomfortable in that conversation. So how do we get those people to be comfortable enough to bring themselves to the table and then help make a difference? Because the only way that we can make a difference is that the people that are in positions of power and privilege come to the table and say, we want to change it too. And that's a challenge, and it's going to continue to be a challenge for a long time. So yeah.
Interesting. And final question. It's a broad one, this, but I think it's quite an interesting place to finish. What do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Whoa. That's a tough one. It's a tough one and an interesting one. What do I know now that I wish I knew then? I think for me, I think it's that I wish I knew that there was so much variety in terms of perspective that is brought out and ingrained in people from quite a young age. Because I think, as I mentioned before, my whole experience is influenced by my upbringing, my background, the people that are around me. So I tend to think the same as a lot of other people. And then when you get into a conversation where somebody doesn't think anything like you, where racism comes up and transphobia and homophobia and things like that come up, you sit there and especially when I was beginning to have these kind of conversations, and this probably, like 6 years ago when these things started coming up to the fore, you're like, how do you have this frame of mind? How do you have it before? So I wish I knew then that there's all of these environmental factors and social factors that go into play in terms of somebody's kind of mindset. Now I don't get so angry about it. I go from a place of education and trying to educate. But I used to get, when I was younger, just like, how could you even think that? How can you think that my life is worth less than yours just simply because I'm gay or because I'm black and the like? So I think that knowing something like that would have probably stopped a lot of a lot of anger.
Well, it's nice you've come out the other side of that.
Yeah.
And as you said, the fact that you get to have those conversations, I would imagine, on a fairly regular basis in your role with a wide variety of people, you've got a huge opportunity to implement change there and understand why people think that way, and perhaps plant a seed of of realization that might over time change the way that they think about things.
100%, and I think that is the opportunity that I have in this role now, to be able to do that. Yeah, and it's a lot of responsibility at times, it does feel like.
Yeah.
It's a task I'm willing to take on.
Well, thank you, Liam. That's been really, really interesting. I feel we've covered some good ground there. Really appreciate you taking the time, and yeah, some good tips there for people who want to bring that conversation into their own organisation, and how they can start to think about things. So thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.